the skies.
Good evening, Cabaret Labbers. How we doing? All good, I hope. And yes, I have a story for you tonight. I hope you enjoy it. Now, this is an old Anglo-Saxon times story from Bamber Castle up in Northumberland. And it centres around the Laidley Worm. Now, first things you need to know, that being Anglo-Saxon, of course, we're going to be using some Old English. So, by way of explanation, the Laidley Worm isn't a worm, not how we think of it these days. It's actually worm as in W-I-R-E-R-M. And Laidley means loathsome. Worm means monster. So, it's a story of a loathsome monster, which is great. That's what we like, isn't it? Monsters. And so, I shall begin. So, King Ida lived at Bamber Castle, and he was an elderly gentleman, and his wife had died some years previously, and he decided he didn't want to live his life alone. He had two children, a son who was Childwind, and a daughter Margaret, who he was very proud of, but he wanted someone to see him in his dotage. And so he set off to find a new queen. And he did, in fact, find and meet a woman and promptly fell in love. And her name was Belloc. Now, unknowns to him, Belloc was in fact a witch. But, nevertheless, he took her back to the castle and they were married. And shortly after the festivities had finished, she developed a great jealousy for Margaret. The reason being that Margaret was beautiful and very, very popular. And the Queen really didn't like this. So she hatched a rather nasty little plan to get rid of her. So she tempted her down to the cave, and this is the cave where she used to practice her magic. And there she cast a spell on young Margaret. And the spell went like this. I weird ye to be a Laidley worm, unborrowed shall ye never be. Until Childwind, the king's own son, come to the hoy and thrice kiss thee. Until the world comes to an end, borrowed shall ye never be. Now, a couple of things you need to know. A hoy is actually a hill, and borrowed means to be disenchanted. In other words, the son would have to find her and do something to lift the spell. And so the story goes on. Now, she was turned into a hideous monster, and it was, in fact, a toad. Look at that. Isn't that magnificent? And so this huge, loathsome creature hopped off into the lands and was not seen again. Of course, the king was absolutely devastated. He had no idea what happened to his daughter. She had just disappeared, and he was in mourning for quite some time. But after a few weeks, there started to be rumours of a terrible monster that was prowling the lands and causing havoc. Entire flocks of sheep were disappearing overnight. And so the locals started to campaign to the king that he had to do something. He had to find this monster and destroy it. And of course, the king, being quite elderly, wasn't up to fighting a monster himself. And so he sent word to his son, who had gone abroad. Now, Childwind, on hearing what had happened, of course, immediately returned, so he jumped on a ship and started sailing back to England. Now, the evil witch knew that he was approaching the coast, and she hatched a spell and whipped up a storm to try and wreck the ship before it made it to land, but fortunately for everyone, it failed, and the ship did, in fact, land. And Child departed the ship, and he grabbed his sword and set off into the countryside to find the terrible monster. And so he did. He found the toad at the bottom of Spindleston Hoy. And there, he approached the toad, he drew his sword, and just as he was about to strike the fatal blow, he noticed tears rolling down the eyes. And he was absolutely taken aback. He'd never seen a monster cry, of course. And then the monster spoke. Strike me not, for I am your sister. And the prince stood there, mouth agape, looking at this incredible creature, and realised what had happened, that the disappearance of his sister and the monster were, of course, tied together. And so he said, what can I do? And the sister said to him, You must kiss me 3 times, and you must do it before the sun sets. Now, the prince, being a brave and stoic young man, knew that this was going to be some task, but dutifully he went ahead. And so he kissed the toad once, but nothing happened. He kissed the toad twice, and still nothing happened. And at this point, apparently, he was actually retching and really wanted to throw up, because the monster was actually described as such. It was hideously ugly, slimy, scaly, and with fetid breath. I mean, how delightful is that? But, like I said, being a brave and stoic young man, he took it on himself, and he did it. He kissed her a 3rd time. And suddenly, with a great hiss and a roar, the monster shrank before his very eyes, and the scales fell from its skin. And there, in front of him, stood his sister. And of course, the two of them were absolutely overjoyed. And they made their way back to the castle, and the king was absolutely ecstatic. He was so happy to have his daughter back. Now, the prince set off to find the evil queen, and eventually he found her hiding in a tower at the top of the castle. And there, he approached her, and with a twig of rowan, which is known to defeat evil, he touched her with the twig, and she immediately turned into the very toad herself. And she hopped off down to the castle and into her cave. And there, the gate was put on it, and she was made to stay there forevermore. Now, as the legend goes, every 7 years, the gate opens. And should anybody enter the cave and approach the toad, if they are to unsheathe the sword of Childwind 3 times, and then blow the horn of Childwind 3 times, and then kiss the toad, she will transform back to herself. Funnily enough, apparently she never has. But there we are. Bye!